whether it was Kalyan Singh as Chief Minister, whether it was Mr. Advani as the leader of the opposition, would have been much too great at that time to allow the masjid to be demolished. That's a positive impact. I believe the media in that sense does play an interventionist role. I know many of you think it's manic, and we'll come to the negative sides. But the fact is, in its own manic way, it does play a consciously interventionist role in events of public importance. Let's be, television has become a first information report. We are an FIR. Anything happens anywhere, we're there, someone gives a soundbite, and you have the story up on air. It's immediate, it's live. You now have, it's now possible to broadcast virtually from any part of the world with minimal effort. You can even send in live pictures now through certain new mobile technology. Technology is changing us. So there's a certain immediacy, a certain urgency, which brings which has a certain dynamism of its own. And that's what the media explosion has done. It's provided remarkably each and every Indian citizen, in his or own way, a tool of empowering himself or herself. Whether we like it or not, today, with so many channels and so many studio discussions, live programs, the politicians are in your drawing rooms every day. Maybe 40 years ago, Mr. Rani probably will be able to tell us better. Ministers sat in Altino or wherever they were in Delhi, in Goa or in Lutyens, Delhi, and never really interacted. You only saw the leaders of the government cutting ribbons. You never saw the opposition, because Doordarshan never showed the opposition. And there was no real connect. You didn't know what your minister was doing. You didn't know what your member of parliament was doing. Today, good, bad and ugly again, you can actually be in a situation where at least either someone like me, through some kind of a medium, or someone like you as member of an audience can get up and ask a politician, "Aapne paise liye?" I'll never forget during the Hawala days, it was early days of television journalism, 95, 96. Mr. Vidyacharan Shukla, former INB minister, was accused in the Hawala case. Coming out of court, looking completely officious, suddenly a mic comes in. "Sir, aapne paise liye?" No, Vidyacharan Shukla in his nightmare would not have, in his real pomp, would not have imagined any journalist coming up to him and asking him that. But now the nature of television, and that was 95, now in the competitive world, you'll have someone saying, "Aapne paise liye," the other person, "Isne paise hi liye hai." So, competition makes you do even stranger things. But it does build an interrogative spirit, a slightly adversarial note into the nature of journalism. It creates a combative spirit. It did in its own way, at least television in its early years. And thereby, in a strange way, it empowered us all. It gave us a sense that maybe we too can question our politicians. Maybe the distance between the netas and us is not as great as we like to believe it was 30, 35 years ago. Today, in that sense, the neta is much more accountable than he was 30, 35 years ago. And television, in its own small way, has done that. It's also provided many more media persons an opportunity. At the end of the day, the mushrooming of so many channels means that many more jobs, many more opportunities, many more young men and women have opportunities that frankly we never had. The reason one became an assistant editor in Times of India was no other reason but that one wasn't good enough to play cricket for the country or even for the state, and therefore one wasn't a good enough lawyer to come back and practice. Therefore, one returned to the Times of India, which was still living in a colonial hang-up that if you had come from Oxford University, then you were good enough to be assistant editor. If you came from Bombay University, then you became a reporter. If you came from Oxford, you became an assistant editor. Frankly, that's the nature of the beast, and that's how the colonial system operated. But today, young people have many more opportunities. We have people who are coming from Bhagalpur University, who are coming from Meerut University, who are coming into Hindi channels, and I see today, particularly in the Hindi channels, a certain sense of self-esteem, which I never saw in the early years when I used to work with people from Maharashtra Times or Navbharat Times, even though I would look up to them as people who knew far more than I did. I always believed that the regional journalist had his ear to the ground. Angrezi journalist used to take the news from the regional journalist and put it with his byline. But it was usually the regional journalist who had his ear to the ground. And today those regional journalists finally have had their moment in the sun, courtesy television, because in television, Hindi channels frankly, and not today and we'll come to that, but Hindi channels a few years ago did much better journalism than us. They were much more aggressive, much more combative, asked the right questions. These are all the positive changes that have taken place. Paradoxically though, we now are in a situation where quantity, many more news channels, doesn't lead to quality. And that's where the negatives come from. Any glass is half full, it's also half empty. Much of what I've said today is about the glass being half full. But there is also a half empty glass. There is something in television now which is called TRP, television rating points. 6,000 boxes put across the country are supposed to measure the ratings of every channel. Every Wednesday or every Thursday the ratings come out. It's like box office. But media is not box office. News is not box office. But yet what has happened is because you're in a ratings point culture now in the news business, frenetic competition has set in. Competition that has meant that sensationalism takes over somewhere from substance. If you have 50 people marching against Mr. Digambar Kamat's government, the channel will say thousands have come in. Mass protests. Anti-reservationist. It happened a few years ago during the anti-reservationist protests. 200, 300 doctors gathered outside AIMS and we made it out to be with water cannons being hit. Mass protests. All students are up in arms. As it turned out, the pro-reservationists had the numbers with them. But television, which is adept at magnifying an image, showed it to be that as if hundreds were out there or thousands were out there and changed the nature of the debate. You have a situation now where, whether we like it or not, the medium wants violence, wants confrontation, wants blood and gore. We want to somewhere show that, somewhere shock the viewer. It's a shock and awe policy. It's a bit like what George Bush wanted to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are now doing with the Indian viewer. How do I shock you? How do I leave you in a situation where you cannot leave that remote control? You hang on to it. If someone like Mr. Nandan Nilekani or Rohini Nilekani is giving a reasoned discussion, do you want to watch it? You may want to. But if the other channel is going to show blood and gore and people fighting with each other and blood-spattered screens, you're dramatizing content. And maybe that's where you want people to go. You're creating a situation where sensationalism scores over substance. My old friend Mr. V.N. Gadgil, a politician for whom I had a high degree of admiration, once told me, he said, I don't understand your television. I gave a wonderful speech on secularism for 30 minutes and your channel has only carried 10 seconds of it. How is the viewer going to understand all that I've tried to say about secularism? I said, Gadgil sir, tumi zara lokar bola. 10 seconds, how can I speak? Poor Mr. Gadgil eventually had to leave as Congress spokesperson and in came in dashing young men who were ready with their 15 or 20 second sound bites, most of them lawyers. But it changed the way. It changed the way the politician was being asked to react. The politician of substance had to give way to the politician of the soundbite. You see it now happening in front of you day by day. The notion of breaking news has completely broken down. Mulayam Singh Yadav goes to meet Sonia Gandhi, breaking news. Mulayam Singh Yadav leaves Sonia Gandhi's house, breaking news. Mulayam Singh Yadav and Amar Singh holding dinner meeting, breaking news. And it has to be big letters, because small letters, it seems that people can't see for some odd reason. It has to be big, it has to be bold. It's shock and awe journalism. It's not journalism which one thought in its classical way would inform people, but journalism which in some way would almost intimidate the viewer. We had a situation the other day where you built in a certain trivialization of the news process, as a result of which a Shah Rukh Khan when he's having his shoulder surgery, it becomes the top headline. Shah Rukh is a master. He's mastered the art of what the media explosion has done. He will give 20 interviews to 20 channels in the space of a day. Each of them will be told it's exclusive. Each of them will carry it. Shah Rukh Khan only on this channel. And thereby has added to a certain trivialization of the news. Because there's a celebrity culture. You have to have Shah Rukh Khan in a sense to even sell perhaps tomorrow a good drought. Unless you have Shah Rukh Khan there, it won't work. You'll have to take him to the drought affected area before that story becomes a headline. So 10 days ago when an interim budget was announced, okay, it didn't have much to its credit. The Taliban had attacked and killed a journalist and beheaded a journalist. The headline in many Hindi news channels in particular was Shah Rukh Khan's shoulder surgery. So you have inbuilt a certain trivialization of the news plays. There is, as a result, less space for rural India. There is a certain metrofication of the news business today. We all live in cities, we all talk to people from our cities, we talk to our peer group, and that's our universe. It extends to, it's a metro versus, it's a big city versus a village problem. It's also a big state versus a small state problem. Many of us don't have reporters in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, in the smaller states of the northeast. It's expensive. We're not willing to invest in setting up bureaus there. We'll get some stringer to send in some stuff, but we're not willing in that sense to be truly national. Because it's so much easier to actually create our worldview, our media worldview, from what lies just within a few kilometers of our looking, of our vision. My friend and colleague Yogendra Yadav put it well. One channel had a program at that time called Raat Baki Hai, Raat Baki. Program was about page 3 parties that you would see in the night. It was at 11. So Yogendra once said, Kiski raat ya baki hai? Whose night is left? Is it only of the celebrities? Is it of the people in general? Are we consciously thereby creating a celebrity culture, trivializing news, building a certain culture where substance doesn't matter, where style does, where sensation matters, where substance doesn't? It has, in a sense, and this is not just television. Across media, you have the rapid march of page 3. Page 3 has slowly, over the last 10 years, come on page 1. The classic example I give is when Musharraf was coming for the Agra summit. The Times of India, bless its soul, carried, which is usually ahead of others in doing these things, in catching the trend, put out a small box item that had an article written by a Delhi model who said that she thought Musharraf was very cute because he liked dogs. And that was front page news. I would have accepted it in the page 3 culture. I like page 3, I read it, I find out what's happening there, I like the color of it, but it shouldn't have been on page 1. And with time, page 3 has crept on page 1 and removed the space that is there, that should be there for the kind of vigorous debates this country needs. The debates which should be there. There is much too much, and this is the great irony of our times, that we have so many news channels, and yet the space for dissent, for debate, the space for breaking with consensus is getting less and less. Mr. Nilagiri may not agree, but if you look at the pink papers, you believe India is still marching ahead. But there is no slowdown. The slowdown is something that they are uncomfortable with, because it will force them to ask a few tough questions of themselves possibly. Do we have a vigorous debate possibly on the nature of the NREGA? I haven't seen it. Not a vigorous debate. Is it good? Is it not so good? Is it working? We haven't seen that kind of journalism. In that sense, as I said, while we have quantity, we may not necessarily have quality. The stakes are getting higher, and thereby the space for independent journalism is reducing. Because what happens is when you have so many channels, the pie is the same. And you have many more channels scrambling for the same pie. And thereby our business model gets more and more affected. And somewhere down the line as a result, we do get influenced much more today perhaps by state interests and corporate interests than we did 20 years ago. So ironically, while we've broken the monopoly of the government on the one hand, we've also entered into a more incestuous relationship with the political class, with corporate interests, perhaps than ever before. And that is one of the great ironies of our time. That we should be an adversarial medium with the power of technology, with the power of being able to break the government monopoly, to do much more investigative journalism than we did 20 years ago. Ironically, much more investigative journalism was perhaps done 20 years ago than is been done today, particularly when it involves the state and corporate interests. In fact, I believe that the one group that has always got away increasingly is corporate India. Satyam was not a scam exposed by the media. Satyam happened for various reasons. The media only took the story up later. We never touched large corporates. Difficult too. Many of us today are companies that are listed companies. We have shareholders, and therefore every quarter our quarterly results do start mattering. In that situation, how do you in some way insulate our journalism from those pressures? The fact is that many more politicians, more than ever before today, control media channels. In certain states of this country, the entire politicians, and with due respect to the gentleman here, are cleverer than media persons. They have realized that the best way to control, we've lost our monopoly, but we will yet control you. How do you do it? You control cable operations. In state after state, the clever politicians, and this is not I'm not suggesting Mr. Kamath try this, but in state after state, politicians today are becoming cable businessmen, either in their own name or the name of their sons and daughters. Classic example, Tamil Nadu. Impossible today in Tamil Nadu to do a story against the DMK government. Only one who does it is Jaya TV, and because Jaya TV promotes Jayalalitha, that nobody is going to believe a story that they do. When she comes to power, she'll take over the cable business. When Dayanidhi Maran lost out in the battle with Karunanidhi, the first thing Karunanidhi did was to try and crush the cable business of Sun TV. The Akali Dal has been even cleverer. All the young new cable operators in Punjab are all now being grouped under the Akali umbrella. You want to do a story against the Akalis, be prepared for your channel to be taken off in Punjab. They're clever. It's happening in the Northeast. I was delighted to learn that 4 new channels had started in Northeast. Then someone came and told me all 4 are started by ministers, sir. And 3 of them by ruling party ministers, because in the last 5 years they obviously have made enough money to start a cable business. Difficult, much more difficult for an opposition politician to start a business than for a government politician to start a business. So you have a situation today where, despite the fact that, as I said at the start, the monopoly of the government has been broken, in its own way the politician still controls a large measure of what goes on as news, particularly in regional channels. We tried to start a channel in Andhra Pradesh last year in Telugu. We were told in not so uncertain terms that if we started it with this particular newspaper, we would not be given a license. Why? Because the chief minister is having a running battle with that newspaper editor, who 1 week later he arrested and put into jail. The level of tolerance for criticism is getting less and less in many of our states. Many of our states are single window states run by large, powerful chief ministers, whether it's a Mayawati, a Badal, Karunanidhi, often by one family, who will not allow any space for dissent. What does the media do in that kind of a system? The space for an independent media, therefore, is getting more and more limited. As I said, there are greater pressures on channel bottom lines. There's a greater homogeneity of information, less space for active dissent, for putting out different kinds of stories which will tell me various stories about NREGA, positive, negative. Bring me the story. Tell me different stories. We don't as effectively as perhaps we did 10, 15 years ago. Perhaps that's because there's less space for training. Younger reporters come and everybody overnight wants to be a star. It's goodbye journalism, hello media. So you're coming into the media to become famous. Because you want your face, it's the face value that matters more than anything else. No young reporter today wants to come into television unless he or she can anchor. Less time for training. We don't have time to train people. They don't have time to go through training school or go through 10 years of journalism before they arrive. And whether we like it or not, things are getting more and more unethical. Because what competition can do at one level is that at one level it can galvanize you, motivate you, energize you, force you to innovate. But at another level, competition also can reduce the moral standards because you want to take shortcuts to get ahead. A concrete example. A few months ago, there was a story going on a particular story which had been filed from Gujarat about a case against a minister. Now, I knew the officer who had been handling the case. It's an old riots case. So I rang him up. I said, have you really charged this minister? He said, no, aisa kuch nahi hai. Somebody has sent a complaint. But I said, sir, I'm seeing it on this channel that you have filed charges against the minister. He said, not true. So since the editor of that channel was a friend, I rang him up. And I told him, this is not true. That I've just checked up, this is not true. He said, okay. Half an hour later, I still saw it. I rang him back. I said, did you check? He said, you were right, it's not true, but I thought, let it go for a little while. So thoda people will, because the story is already moving ahead. Wouldn't have happened 10, 15 years ago. Today, you want, as I said, to dazzle, to shock and awe. One of the great ironies of our time, and I wrote it the other day, is that while we are moving in this direction, Pakistan, which 10 years ago was struggling to deal with private television, is actually celebrating the arrival of private television as a genuine weapon of democratic empowerment today in Pakistan. If there is one institution which is taking on governments, which was genuinely responsible for providing a certain muscle to the mass movement against Musharraf, it was the media then. And ironically, Musharraf decided to open up private media after he saw what Indian television had done in the late 90s, particularly in the period before and after the Kargil war, when Indian television was being watched in Pakistani homes instead of PTV, he decided to open up media. And today that same media has become the one weapon in a sense in Pakistan that takes on the system. Where ironically in our country we are moving in the other direction. We are becoming much more entwined with the system than we ever were before. Is there a future? Where does the future go? One would like to believe in an ideal world that there will be consolidation. That you won't have 460 channels bombarding your senses. That somewhere down the line you'll have fewer channels. That somewhere down the line you'll have fewer newspapers. That somewhere down the line perhaps you'll open up the media to quality rather than just to quantity. Will that happen? I'd like to believe it will. I'd like to believe that we have just completed in 2009 the first phase of that revolution that started in 1995, courtesy Mr. P.V.R.K. Prasad, bless his soul. The first phase of the revolution is the breaking down of the monopoly of the government over the airwaves.